Kwaba, welcome to this week's edition of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, podcast and entrepreneur. And this week's edition of Ghana in Focus is special. Today is Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Day, celebrating the life of Kwame Nkrumah. And this edition of Ghana in Focus, we're talking about Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, and African emancipation. So a very, very interesting topic here for you today, special day, which is the Earth Day of Kwame Nkrumah. Well, it's 21st, but today, the 22nd of September, it's a national holiday in Ghana, and people are celebrating and, commemorating the Earth Strong, or the birthday of Kwame Nkrumah, the great man, and what he stood for, not just for Ghana, not just for the African continent, but for the Black race, African race, generally speaking. So this is a very, very interesting discussion that we're going to have. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, and African emancipation. Before then, just to make you aware that if you like what you hear, please share it with your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. We want to get as many followers as we can on that platform. Also, subscribe to Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Again, just look out for Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Click the follow button, and that will mean that every time we upload a new podcast on Spotify, Spotify will notify you, okay? And if you want to donate to a show, we accept, kind donations. So if you want to donate to a show to help us to continue to bring you fantastic content coming out of Ghana and from the African continent, then please do. You can subscribe, or you can donate rather as little as $3 a month. So you can do it as a month or just a one-off payment, and just click on the donate button. Again, if you want to do business in Ghana, you want to look at things like, citizenship, you want to look at things like the Ghana card, how I set up, how I register business in Ghana, look at land, etc. Then we do offer a consultation session. I've got 10 years, more than 10 years of experience of doing business in Ghana. So if you want to, if you are interested in doing business in Ghana or come to Ghana, things that you may need, some information that you may require, then the email address is in the funnels to the show. You can just drop me a quick email, and then we can book you in for a consultation. So it's $30 an hour for a full consultation, or $20 for half an hour briefing session. All right, so let's get into this podcast, looking about Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, and African emancipation. Now, did you know that, since John Mahama came back to power, he won last year's election by a massive landslide, and he was inaugurated on the 7th of January this year. John Mahama has made some very, very interesting moves on the African continent that are beginning to roll the West, the same way that Nkrumah moves roll the West. Let me tell you what Mahama has done since becoming president in these 8 short months. So, under Mahama, Ghana has quietly been strengthening its ties with the Sahel countries, so the AES, the Alliance of Sahelian States, namely Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, who have rejected French imperialism, and French and American military presence in their countries by, as I mentioned, the newly formed Pan-African Alliance that they call the AES. Now, why this is important is because Mahama's moving in strategic direction, and this is quite ironic, because if you were there, or if you saw streams of or YouTube videos of John Mahama's inauguration, of all the African leaders that attended the inauguration of John Mahama, the leader who got the biggest cheer was who? Ibrahim, Traore, or Burkina Faso. So the youth in Ghana, as well as the youth around the world, underscore the importance of what Ibrahim Traore is doing by disassociating himself from French colonial rule and by getting rid of French and American military attaché in the country. So just like Nkrumah and his Casablanca group, the AES, the alliance of the AES, threatens Western hegemony, particularly in the Francophone area, so-called Francophone area. So you have these 14 countries in Africa that speak French. So your Burkina Faso, your Mali, your Niger, Benin, Togo, La Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Cameroon, and there's a couple of others, Congo, Brazzaville, a couple of others. That AES threatens that Francophone grip that they've had on Africa for the best part of 60 years. And so, you know, by Mahama trying to make those moves strategically to form a broader alliance with the AES, that's sending panic bells in London, Paris, and Washington. However, and this is even why Ghana, since Nkrumah, Ghana has always been at the center of the African Renaissance. Yeah, we saw with Nkrumah, yeah, he showed the way for African liberation and Africans gaining independence in the late 50s and 60s. Now, Ghana is trying to be a driver by trying to align itself with the AES. This is what Nkrumah did when Nkrumah formed nearly 65 years ago the Casablanca group that involved Ghana, Guinea, and I believe Mali. And so Ghana is also exploring new energy partnerships here. So that's because since the turn of the year, but credit has to be credit due, the last NPP government started this you could say uplift within the reserves of Ghana getting in terms of the gold. NPP started that by the gold for oil program that enabled Ghana to barter its gold for oil and use some of that gold to get gold reserves. And since the turn of the year when Mahama came in, those gold reserves have now been strengthened because the NDC under Mahama have got a program. They've scrapped the gold for oil program. They've now constituted a board called the Gold Board, whereby Ghana is now retaining, as like previously, Ghana is now retaining a lot of gold that is mined in Ghana as compared to previous governments that allowed the West to take about 95% of the gold outside of Ghana. Under this gold board that Mahama instituted, beginning of January, yeah, Ghana has now been able to muster a lot of gold reserves. So because of this, then, Ghana is now exploring partnerships in terms of energy. And I told you recently about the big push for Mahama, went to Japan to seek investment in energy and renewable energy infrastructure. Remember that? So aside from that, it's also Ghana has also been using a subtle shift away from IMF dependency, yeah. And this is sending a clear message that Ghana might become too independent to handle. And this is definitely a threat to the West. This is again a reason why Nkrumah was, had to come down, but I'll get to that in a minute. So Ghana now flexes its muscles because of the gold reserves that it's got now by looking elsewhere apart from the West for its energy renewables and its energy future. Yeah. And again, I told you about the city going up beginning of the year or mid the year. It's gone down a bit, but it's still 23% up as it was as opposed to January this year. That's because Ghana has ignored in a certain way IMF diktats and is using gold reserves just to prop up the city. Yeah. But now it's been a bit lenient recently, which explains why the Ghana city has lost a bit of value recently because the government of Ghana is not really, pushing as it was the gold reserve avenue, whereby it's using gold reserves to strengthen the city. So, and even the IMF kind of rebuked Ghana in that point, which made Ghana, put levers a bit and not go full throttle with, the strength of the Ghana city. Because if it did, the Ghana city would be probably, would probably be between about 9 and 10 to $1, as opposed to it now being between 12 and 13 to $1. When you compare that to the beginning of the year, when it's about 15 to $1, then you see the significance of Ghana's gold reserves and Ghanaians' gold reserves as a lever to make the currency strong. So this is, this is kind of making the West a bit jittery about Ghana, and why Ghana needs to be looked at carefully because of two things. Because of one, its drift to become self-reliant, as what Nkrumah wanted to do, and also its alliance apparently with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. In actual fact, Ghana has allowed Burkina Faso to use its port because Burkina Faso is a landlocked country, and the Côte d'Ivoire, which is a puppet of the West, of France in particular, will not allow Burkina Faso to use its port. Yeah, so Ghana has also allowed Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger to use its port to be able to export its goods to other countries. So this is again hampered, is again annoying France in particular, because France controlled, those key components of those economies of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So this is kind of deja vu, because this is something similar to what Nkrumah did. So what we see now is that the West now want to try and make an example of Ghana, like we did in Nkrumah's day. So, and this is important because when Kwame Nkrumah declared Ghana's independence, and sought to lead a united, self-sufficient Africa, Western powers at the time, as they are today, they panicked. Because Nkrumah was not really, he didn't really prove alliances with the West. He made more alliances with China, as some African countries are doing today. They're kind of leaving the West and wanting to forge alliances with the likes of China and India. So, and at the time, the Soviet Union also, Nkrumah, tried to form partnerships with. So, aside from this, Nkrumah also launched industrial projects, because he wanted to industrialize Ghana as a model, as a template for the rest of Africa, and he rejected IMF dependency, So Nkrumah, up until the first 7 years, Nkrumah didn't go to IMF. Nkrumah did not go to the IMF because as leader of government business in 1951, Kwame Nkrumah was able to use the cocoa receipts that Britain was stealing and using that to build Britain after Second World War. Kwame Nkrumah said, no, I'm not going to allow you to take our cocoa receipts, and you use it for your economy. I'm going to use it for my economy, Ghana. So by the time that Ghana became independent from British colonial rule in 1957, Nkrumah had amassed reserves of over $250 million. And that's what Nkrumah used to redevelop Ghana, after 1957. The harbor, the gold factory, the Ghana Airways, the Tema Community Project, the steel company, etc., etc. So this was a threat. This was a direct threat to Western hegemony. Aside from that, Nkrumah's vision of an African investment bank, an African high command for security and military purposes, and also Nkrumah proposed a single currency, this threatened the US petrodollar system. Again, Nkrumah's support for liberation movements all over the continent, like the ANC. Nkrumah supported the ANC, yeah, in Kuntu-Busizwe, the military wing of the ANC. Nkrumah also supported in the Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Nkrumah also supported Mugabe in so-called Rhodesia at the time, Zimbabwe today. Yeah, Nkrumah, you know, supported not just financially, but also, you know, militarily and training, and also psychologically helped these liberation movements. And that again challenged the Western dominance in global politics. And again, we see this today with Ghana trying to forge alliances with the AAS. That's, you know, ringing the timbers of the West. So we see the same thing that Nkrumah did, the same thing that's happening in Ghana now, with Mahama making his strategic moves to join the AAS. So all this is what Nkrumah did, right? In terms of the industrialization of Ghana, in terms of the African Unity Project, in terms of the African Central Bank, in terms of the African Military High Command, supporting liberation movements, yeah, is why Nkrumah had to go. Now, the coup of 1966, right, which was mustered by the CIA of America with British MI6 support, that coup wasn't just a coup, right? It was a surgical demolition of African sovereignty, because Nkrumah, what it was doing was trying to make Ghana, not just Ghana, but Africa sovereign. You know, last week I was talking about, you know, sovereignty by not allowing Japan and Pakistan to invest in our own country, in Ghana, but to seek African support, particularly African diaspora support and home support, because it gives us sovereignty over our economy. Yeah. And so the white men don't like this. The West have never liked Africa to be sovereign. So this is why that coup, yeah, was like a strategical demolition of African sovereignty, because Nkrumah had dared to build an independent Pan-African state, i.e. Ghana, which included nationalizing Ghana's economy and resist neo-colonial interference. So all these things that Nkrumah did, amongst others, by building the Akosombo Dam, Ghana Airways, Tema Harbor, yeah, and also by refusing IMF conditionalities, made Nkrumah a marked man, yeah? He made Nkrumah a marked man. This is why Nkrumah had to go. So, in the same way, yeah, that they knew best, that the West, all that they know is when you have leaders like Nkrumah, and now what we see with the AES, Ibrahim Traore and others, yeah, what the West does, what the white man does is basically to kill Africa, to kill. So this is why, yeah, when you look at Ibrahim Traore, more than 25 attempts in his life have been made. Why? Because Traore is a new Nkrumah, yeah. In Traore is showing the way in his own country, Burkina Faso, and he's instrumental, like Nkrumah, in terms of the Casablanca group. Ibrahim Traore is instrumental with the formation of the Alliance of Sahelian States, the AES, yeah? And so what they did to Nkrumah in 1966, yeah, was economic strangulation. They sabotage, yeah, Ghana's economy. The same way, if they had, they probably think of it, they want to sabotage Burkina Faso economy, Mali economy, and Niger economy, yeah? So going back in 1966, they sabotaged Ghana's economy, right? By covert funding of opposition infiltration, by covert funding in terms of the NPP, who back then were called the UGCC, yeah? And then they funded also renegade military forces in terms of Ghana armed forces. So people like Kotaka, General Ankara, Afrifa, they were the ones who deposed Nkrumah, yeah? But they were funded by the white man. And also they use psychological warfare by saying that Nkrumah is a dictator, blah, blah, blah. He's doing this, doing that, as part of the effort to get rid of Nkrumah, the same way that the West will try to discredit Ibrahim Traore, which is why early this year, there was a global day of protest, particularly in the African world, yeah, that if you dare remove Traore, you kill him, like he did in Nkrumah, things happen to you. And so what they will do to Traore is try and use media propaganda that, and it's already been started that, oh, he's a dictator, he's not allowing for free so-called elections, he's using the wealth to enrich his family, blah, blah, blah. This is the same propaganda they used to get rid of Nkrumah. And so, at the time of the coup 1966, while Nkrumah was away on a peace mission to Vietnam, Hanoi, a CIA MI6-backed military coup overthrew his government. And this evidence is no longer, this is not conjecture. This has been openly admitted by the white man, America, in declassified CIA documents. Yeah, when they admit, the CIA admits that they're monitoring Nkrumah's Pan-African activities and consider him a threat to Western interests. Just like today, they're monitoring Ibrahim Traore and the AES because the activities of Ibrahim Traore and the AES are a threat to French in particular, but also Western interests in Africa. So, when Nkrumah was overthrown, yeah, a Western puppet, yeah, was put in place in Ghana. The so-called National Liberation Council, yeah, they were the puppets, they were the soldiers, renegade soldiers, who had been infiltrated by American intelligence and also by British secret services. Yeah, people like General Ankara, Afrifa, and who's the other one? Afrifa, yeah, Kotaka, Afrifa, and Ankara. Yeah, they were the members of the so-called National Liberation Council. They were basically pro-Western, very, very puppet, regime. And they put Ghana on a backward trajectory by erasing Nkrumah's 7-year development plan and other Nkrumahist policies that Nkrumah had proposed or put in place while in power. And so this put Ghana back at least 50 years. It's only now that Ghana is beginning to recover from that, destruction by the West that they have done to Ghana since Nkrumah was removed into the 6th. And so this is why Ghana is again being posed a threat, because they see Ghana, like they did back then, as the, you could say, godfather of African emancipation. And Mahama is moving strategically to form alliances who are non-Western for a purpose to have African emancipation. But the West is threatened by African emancipation. As long as the West is there, they will never, ever allow Africa to unite. Yeah? And let me tell you why Western powers resist any semblance of African unity and why they need to kill, African leaders who they feel present a threat to their hegemony of Africa. So the big one is resource control. Yeah, this is why the West will do anything and everything that they can to stop African unity. Because one, resource control. Now check this. Africa holds 90% of the world's platinum, half, 50% of the world's gold, 40% of global reserves of rare earth minerals. This is rare earth gems. There's earth gems that talking about Ukraine the other day, and that Trump wanted to do a minerals deal with Ukraine. There's a rare earth gems that can be used for industrialization. Yeah, there's 40% of that in Africa. Yeah, also, Africa has got vast oil, gas, and hydro power that the West needs. So a lot of this, and also renewable energy like solar. Yeah, did you know that they're thinking of building a solar power farm? I think it's somewhere in North Africa that's going to shine directly on Europe, so that they can have renewable energy at our expense, because because of this Russia-Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia, yeah, i.e. the West, they don't want to buy Russian oil and gas anymore. Yeah, and America has warned them about that. Even Trump the other day said that, I want to help you, yeah, but you're going to help me by buying my oil instead of buying Russian oil and gas. Yeah. So, the West is looking for viable alternative energy sources. So this is why, again, we're looking to Africa, yeah, for the solar power, yeah, because the sun don't shine in Europe every day. Look at right now, we're in autumn in Europe right now, approaching winter. Yeah, it's going to be dark. The days will become shorter, night become longer. Yeah, it's getting cold. So Europe needs that energy reserve that they're buying now from Russia. They're still buying from Russia, but they're looking for alternatives. Yeah, and Africa is the alternative. Aside from that, like I mentioned, Africa has vast oil and gas reserves. Yeah. Also, Africa has lithium. Nucleus about lithium. That is crucial for the AI fourth industrial revolution. Yeah. Look at these electric cars and electric components made of lithium, and half of those lithium reserves are in Africa. Also, Africa has vast agricultural potential. Do you know that a lot of companies, Western companies now, are in Africa trying to buy agricultural land? Like I told you, this is why the white farmers in Zimbabwe, this is what they're doing. White farmers in South Africa. And now, these same white farmers want to go to Mozambique because they understand the importance and the fertile nature of our land. Yeah. Also, United Africa could negotiate as a bloc, yeah, set its own prices and end exploitative contracts. This threatens Western corporations and economies that is been built up on cheap raw material extraction. This is why they fear African unity. This is why Nkrumah to go. Now check this, another reason why they fear African unity. Debt and dependency. Western-led institutions like the IMF World Bank keep African nations in perpetual cycles of debt. So forget it's nonsense, right, that they're coming to help you. No. The IMF and World Bank, their agenda, right, but they're very sweet with their words, they're very deceptive with their words, but their real agenda is to keep African countries in cycles of debt. Yeah, and we saw after Nkrumah got removed, Ghana went to the IMF in 67, I think. Yeah, and Ghana's been to IMF 17 times, and yet economy is still messed up. This is why NDC under Mahama are being very, very smart and not wanting to follow IMF World Bank diktats, yeah, and keeping that cycle of debt because they want to make Ghana, yeah, using its gold reserves now, less dependent on IMF and World Bank. Yeah. So, as we know, loans come with conditions, i.e. privatization of your state companies, austerity, and reducing sovereignty. And that reduces sovereignty, yeah? Like I mentioned, sovereignty is very, very important. Again, a self-sufficient Africa would reject these harsh conditions that have been placed on these loans, yeah? Africa would build its own financial systems and therefore control its own development agenda, because right now, Africa does not control its development agenda. The development agenda is controlled by the West, i.e. under the so-called Millennium Development Goals, now they're called Sustainable Development Goals, yeah? And like I said, this thing about also Japan last week as well, right? We don't need Japan or the West to tell us about development, right? We need to use an African-centered system to develop our content in our countries by having an arrangement by ourselves that dictates how development should be. Development should be an Africa-centered system, not a Western or Asian-centered system. That doesn't work for Africa. Again, geopolitical influence is why the West fear African unity. So Africa's location, strategic in terms of shipping routes, military bases, and also voting blocks in the UN make it a global chessboard. Yeah. So African unity would mean non-alignment, stronger ties with Russia, China, or internal blocks such as ECOWAS or the COMESA, which is the common market of South Africa, East Africa, and then the AU. Yeah, this threatens these alliances, i.e., non-alignment with the West, threatens Western dominance and global diplomacy. Again, African unity or Pan-Africanism promotes indigenous development, cultural revival, and more importantly, political and economic sovereignty, which is very, very important in terms of emancipation and being able to self-determine one's destiny, one's future. Because this self-determination, it rejects the idea that the Western liberal democracy is the only path towards emancipation. That's what Nkrumah said. Nkrumah said that the Western imperialist system is not the model that we should adopt. We should adopt, in his words, an African social system. Yeah, that's the only way that we can emancipate ourselves. So we need to understand what Nkrumah said, right? That this Western liberal democracy that we're following, right, is not for Africa. It never has been for Africa. It's not designed for Africa. This so-called election cycle, every 4 or 5 years, you go and vote, put your thumb on an X or whatever, and you think you got democracy. No, this Western democracy does not work for Africa because it is not designed to work for Ghana, for Africa. Yeah, and so they may say someone like Kagame, who's been in power for 30 odd years, is a dictator, but that's our system. That's our system. You know, one. You know, you could say one party rule or whatever, as opposed to this so-called multi-party democracy that has not worked in Africa for 60 years. And so, you know, a united Africa would challenge the ideological supremacy of the West, offering new models of governance and economic structure. Yeah. And finally, you know, the white man has always feared Africans, like Nkrumah, who pushed unity, right, and sovereignty and self-determination, were either overthrown, assassinated, or demonized, as you see now with Ibrahim Traore. So, what Nkrumah envisioned for Africa is African currency, a continental military high command that would, you know, safeguard our security and our land, because what's happening in DR Congo, what's happening in Somalia, what's happening in Sudan, wouldn't happen if we listened to Nkrumah and if they had the African military high command. Yeah, and all these, you know, renegade forces, all these mercenaries that are in Africa, they would be eliminated had we listened to Nkrumah and had the African high command. Again, shared infrastructure. Yeah, so we share infrastructure. So rather than go to the West, right, to help us build a road, you know, if I'm in Ghana and I want to build a road from, say, Accra to Kumasi, I get my African brothers in maybe Somalia or Namibia or Botswana who are good at that, and they can do the road for me. And then in return, I'll give them some gold or lithium. Yeah, that shared infrastructure knowledge is a threat to the Western global order. We see that today with the AES, because there's now no borders, again, something that Nkrumah envisioned, because the borders, these artificial borders that were put there in the Congress of Berlin in 1985 is an anathema to our emancipation. And so this is why it's important, you know, for Nkrumah on this day, that remember Nkrumah's vision legacy, right? That we need to actually fast track it, because we're not free. Africa is not united, we're not free. Right? And let me tell you what it means for us, what it means for every African person listening to this podcast, wherever you are. Right? So this is not just about history, right? It's about the future of African agency, the future of African sovereignty, and the right of Africans and Africa to self-determine its own future. The West resists unity, not because Africa is weak, but because united Africa is too powerful to control. Because when we united, like Nkrumah urges to do in his book, Africa Unite, and I report to go and buy that book, Nkrumah's book, Africa Unite, or Why Africa Must Unite, yeah? Because Africa will be too powerful to control by Western forces, and they cannot manipulate it anymore. So, in closing, Kwame Nkrumah, as a result of his guidance by the Most High and the ancestors, including people like Marcus Mosiah Garvey, whose book, The Opinion and Philosophies of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, influenced Nkrumah a lot. Nkrumah instilled in us the belief that the Black man is capable of managing his own affairs without Western interference. Nkrumah proved that. Yeah? Nkrumah also told us that we have a right to self-determination, what is in our best interest. Not in someone else's interest, but what's in our best interest as Ghanaians and as Africans. Also to end dependency on the West, because that dependency on the West will only lead to slavery again, yeah? And also to reclaim stolen wealth and dignity-based African by us controlling the resources on the ground and controlling the wealth for ourselves and using that wealth for our developmental program and our self-emancipation and our trajectory as African people. So this is what Nkrumah instilled in us and taught us. So on this day today, when we're celebrating Kwame Nkrumah's legacy and his Earth Day, let us work together as Africans, no matter where you are, whether you're in Ghana, in Brazil, in Australia, in the Solomon Islands, in Indonesia, in USA, in Europe. We're all Africans, and we've got to work together for the betterment of the good of all Africans, because we either think together or we swim together. So I thank you very much for listening to this special edition of Ghanaian Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, entrepreneur, and podcaster. Next week, we'll be looking at health. I put it back on the back burner, but we'll be looking at health, looking about prostate cancer, the prostate cancer myth, and what you need to know about so-called prostate cancer. So until then, from myself, Kwame, from all the crew here on Ghanaian Focus, is thank you very much for listening, and we see you in the next edition of Ghana in Focus.